Hello and welcome to EDH Rec's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDH Rec and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. You better fasten your seatbelts for this one. It's time for a ride. Shorikai Genesis Engine is our first vehicle commander, and it's a showstopper. 4-mana vehicle that crews into an 8/8? That's a high bar, but that activated ability is superb. It draws extra cards and makes pilot tokens. Genesis Engine? More like Value Engine. Shorikai is already 3 times more popular than the face commander from the Buckle Up pre-constructed deck, and it has fast become a home for a very vehicular strategy. With blue and white's pre-existing artifact synergies, this is a creative new deck style for the color pair to explore. Let's grab Shorikai's average deck from the average deck feature and import it to the Architect deck building website. As always, any swaps we make to the list must either keep the total price cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. I have 2 words for this deck. Vroom, vroom. This is a peculiar list, one that I admit I actually kinda had to take a long time to parse correctly. The tempo and overall sequencing of vehicles is very unlike the typical patterns that we're used to for other artifact or even creature-based strategies. When your most important creatures are not actually creatures most of the time, it kind of forces you to rewire your brain a bit in order to play it well. So in fact, I'd actually like to start off this video by giving a really big thank you to the Command Zone's Damon Lenz for giving me advice for Shorikai, and basically being my driving instructor for this video. So first, let's affiliate ourselves with Shorikai's core cards. Mostly we're looking at good vehicles here. The average list as we see it is fully committed to a vehicle theme, with things like Weatherlight and Parhelion and Smuggler's Copter really taking the cake. I'll also shout out Mobilizer Mech and the Peace Walker as all-stars to help Shorikai come to life more easily too. And of course, we can't forget the Mech Titan core. My personal goal in this deck every time is to assemble that Voltron. Whether we win or lose, that right there is a victory all on its own. Beyond that, Unwinding Clock resets our vehicles every turn, which comes in real handy, especially because it lets us activate Shorikai multiple times around. Easily my favorite card in the deck. Intruder Alarm can also be a blowout with the potential to turn our commando into a combo machine if it's been crewed into a creature, constantly untapping every time it makes a new pilot. With a couple of mana dorks in play, that is game-endingly good. Oh, and I'll also give a shout out to the Wrath effects here too. We'll touch more on this later, but vehicles avoid creature-based wrath effects, so our deck can take huge advantage of them. There's a lot happening in this list though, so let's get a move on and start swapping. We've got 3 sections to cover. First, we'll cover the basics by fueling up. Second, we'll take a look around our garage. And third, of course, we have to go fast and furious. Let's start off by filling the tank. I actually want to start off by acknowledging that the current deck building direction that we see laid out in the average list for Shorikai is not the way that I would personally build the deck if I was making it for myself. We'll touch more on this later at the end of the video along with honorable mentions and budget selections, but for now, let's just note that there's a lot of trickiness going on with this commander. But also, these videos aren't for me, you know? These videos are for people who are exploring with these different decks, and what we see them doing right now is some really cool vehicle stuff for Shorikai. So we're going to follow that GPS and improve things along that particular route. But to do that, we have to acknowledge that the vehicle strategy in EDH is like really counterintuitive. To be blunt, I think this current list suffers from preconceived notions about the ways that commander decks are, quote, usually built. For instance, take SRAM here. He draws cards whenever we cast vehicle spells. So this guy's an all-star in equipment decks and aura decks. We are very used to seeing SRAM overperform in those places. Here though, he's bad. I'm sorry, he's just not that wonderful. There are only 16 total cards in this deck that would make him draw us a card. We'd draw more cards if we just played a regular draw spell. Speaking of draw spells though, Universal Surveillance, let's chat. This card also came in the precon, and this card is also not that great here. I do not think this is an outright bad card. I think it happens to not be a good card in this deck. A lot of this deck's current composition makes it appear like it's a classic blue artifact strategy. But it isn't. These vehicles do not perform like other artifact decks, nor do they even perform like artifact creatures, and we're kinda hard up to assemble a huge number of them that would make this improvised cost worth it. A sorcery speed draw spell that invites us to tap down our mana and our defenses? Nah, put this in a deck with a lot more artifact tokens instead. And here's the reason why I feel comfortable removing draw spells like this. Our commander is a draw engine. Draw 2, discard 1, make a token? That's flippin' amazing. That's awesome. That is so good. Our commander is the draw engine, and it's a very difficult machine to kick off of the field. While a little extra draw here and there is certainly nice, our commander honestly has a lot of that base covered. That's even why this deck has such a low land count. Shorikai is wildly good at smoothing out our draws every single turn. I will add one extra card that I do think could help out here though, and that's Manifold Key. I was shocked it wasn't in the deck already. It can untap our commander to activate it multiple times per round, which is amazing, and later on we can use it to make our commander unblockable and chunk enemies for a bunch of damage. Flippin' brilliant. This is the key to the ignition, we gotta play it. And this is a very important lesson for how we should view this deck. Even though a card like SRAM has the words draw and vehicle on him, in this deck, a card like Manifold Key is actually a better draw spell. I'm going to make one last change here in this section, and that's for this here Research Thief. This card looks sick in a deck that has a lot more artifact tokens, not in a deck that has a lot of vehicles that are usually just waiting in the hangar bay and patiently planning out the optimal time for them to finally strike. This thing doesn't draw us a whole lot in this particular strategy, and I'd rather spend mana instead to go and find another vehicle. Deadeye Quartermaster is straightforward, but I like it a lot here. And you know I'm definitely going to use it to go and locate that Mech Titan core. Alright, that's part 1 done. Let's round the corner to part 2. I went through a couple of drafts for this video where I tried to pepper in a bunch of jokey references to actual car models, but I knew that y'all would immediately clock me for pretty clearly knowing nothing at all about cars, so those have all been scrapped, and suffice it to say, there are a few vehicles that are in this average deck that I just don't think are the very best Hot Wheels that we could be playing with. Some of these cars are very cool. Lightning McQueen would be proud. Is that the name of the dude from the Cars movie? I think it is. I don't know. I have seen that movie 0.65 times. But yeah, anyway, I like some of these cards very, very much. Imposter Mech is a clone for any enemy effect that we want for ourselves. The Caravan is ramp and it's on theme. Sky Sovereign is pretty darn rad. However, I found 3 vehicles in this deck that were, frankly, underwhelming. Mindlink Mech, Imperial Recovery Unit, and Colossal Plow. I was delighted to find in my discussions with Damon, who again is a much more experienced Shorikai driver than I am, that he also found himself very dissatisfied with the horsepower on these cards. Colossal Plow crews for 6 and it has a cute effect, but with that toughness level, it usually ends up trading down against a smaller creature. Imperial Recovery Unit just has too few targets to ever get back from the junkyard. And Mindlink Mech? Oh man, I wanted to like this one, but it usually ends up just becoming a copy of, what, like a pilot token? All 3 of these read better than they actually play. It's disappointing, but it's the truth. It's okay though, because we have 2 more vehicles that we will add in here. First, where's Dermo Taxi? Why isn't it in our garage? Did Ferris Bueller take it out for a joyride? Is that why it's missing here? This vehicle is so funny. I'm always tempted to play it in non-vehicle themed decks, but it absolutely has to make a showing in the actual vehicle deck. What a delightful piece of work this card is. And second, Mobile Garrison. It doesn't look like much, but it untaps our commander. That's big. Activating Shorikai multiple times a turn and being able to leave it up to block as well, that's a big boost of advantage. This thing's on theme and it's brilliant, and it secretly does a lot more for our commander than it first appears. That's all for section 2, and it feels like a pretty short section, but that's because we don't want to spend a bunch of time in the garage. We want to take all these bad boys out for a spin. So it's time for our final lap. Let's get Tokyo drifting. Okay, I know I named this section Fast and Furious, but if we're being honest with ourselves, the way that this deck actually plays is a lot less Fast and Furious and a lot more slow and calm. I'm gonna start off this section with one of Damon's biggest pieces of advice for this deck. Fewer creatures, more wraths. I ended up keeping a lot more creatures here than I think is even necessary, but that advice overall is really solid, because again, vehicles dodge board wipes. Clearing the field almost always leaves our stuff untouched, and we're better able to take advantage of an empty board by immediately making tokens with our commander or by playing a few other little creatures and then instantly crashing in with our ready-to-go mech suits. However, there is a wrath effect in this deck that is a very poor example of this philosophy, and that's the card Organic Extinction. This card costs a bunch of mana, requires us to tap the very things that we would like to use to take advantage of the board we're about to clear, and as a result of that, I just don't think it belongs in this deck. Rather, I'd like to include a different pair of Wrath effects, Slaughter the Strong and Dusk to Dawn. These effects are cheap and way asymmetrical. Our pilot tokens will basically always survive these effects, and they'll go on to crew titanic vehicles. Dusk obliterates a bunch of big baddies, leaving our little creatures completely free, and it can even get back a couple of our tiny creatures too if we happen to need it. Wraths are already one-sided for vehicles, and they're even more one-sided now. Shorikai teaches us a very big lesson about how asymmetrical these symmetrical effects can actually be. I'm also going to be very critical of two cards that look like they should help vehicles more than they actually do. Aeronaut Admiral and Armed and Armored. I really wanted to like Armed and Armored. It reads like such a good ability for a vehicle deck. Auto Crew? Heck yeah! Except it's usually only kind of okay. I really wanted to assemble these amazing board states where this card would bring an army of mechs to life and wipe out our enemies, but it's usually just giving us our 8/8 for like one turn, and maybe also a 4/4 sometimes. This card looks like it should have the game-ending potential of an overrun effect, but it's ultimately just spending a card slot to do something the deck actually doesn't struggle with all that much. I'm really disappointed by it, but unfortunately this is just what I experienced with it. And as for the Aeronaut, well, this is Aero not a good card. Flying is a good effect. We want evasion for our vehicles, don't get me wrong, but this thing is not the thing to do it. It's just too killable. I'd so much rather swap it out for a Wonder. Shorikai isn't just a draw outlet, it's also a discard outlet. Wonder goes right to the bin from our hand, and then suddenly all of our robots are swooping through the air with much needed and more permanent evasion. That's not all though. I've absolutely gotta get Rebek in this deck. Each of our artifacts gets protection from just a bunch of stuff. This card makes them super hard to kill and, more importantly, even harder to block. Rebek is insane in this deck, an absolute all-star. I will note that she does turn off some effects like the Manifold Key, or prevents our own Mirage Mirror from copying our stuff, but man, it's worth it. Rebek is a late game card that seals the deal and makes our attackers not just look like Titans, but act like them too. Finally, my last addition is an ode to the artifact destruction of the world. I am all about brilliant restoration for this deck. If someone has blasted all of our stuff to bits, let's get them right back. Or, more importantly, if Shorikai happened to discard them earlier, we'll get them all back now too. Reanimation is brilliant, especially en masse. This card helps us get all of our stuff back after a big wreck, which means this card is, in our case, literally car insurance. That's my final addition for the deck, but I'd actually like to take a brief moment and kind of tip my hand here. Like I said earlier, this vehicle version of the deck is not the way that I'd personally have built Shorikai. Vehicles are exciting and cool and new, and I totally get why players want to play a bunch of them with this cool new commander. But y'all know me, I'm Mr. Necromancy, and if I was building Shorikai, I wouldn't stop at just the brilliant restoration. Shorikai isn't just a source of card draw, it's an amazing discard outlet. Use it to draw a bunch of extra cards and discard, I don't know, Avacyn's, Elesh Norns, Nezahals. Fill the deck with looting effects and toss all of these big baddies into the yard, and then bring them right back with White's small but meaningful suite of Reanimator cards. Blink a Karmic Guide and you get back even more of them. I especially recommend Tidal Force as one of the Reanimator targets actually, because it would untap Shorikai multiple times per round. And honestly, why stop at reanimating creatures? Use Argivian Restoration and Refurbish to get back Darksteel Forges and other fantastic metallic friends. Obviously, this direction for the deck is wildly different than the average, so trying to force that type of strategical shift would have required way too big of a deviation from the average list that I felt it would honestly be disrespectful to the players who want to do the vehicle things with this vehicle commander. But I am a diehard Reanimator player at heart, so I just had to mention this. Maybe Shorikai Reanimator could be its own video in the future, I don't know. But if you want to give a splash of Reanimator in this vehicle strategy, I think it'd be really rewarding. Give it a test drive, that's all I'm saying. Alright, let's coast to the finish with a few honorable mentions. If you're playing Shorikai on a tighter budget than the average list, here are a few ideas to try. There are some pricey cards in the list, but we can replace them pretty easily. Rhystic Study is a draw engine, but we can add in Voltaic Key, the older sister to Manifold Key, and we'll get a lot of the same utility, allowing us to untap our commander multiple times to draw and discard more cards. Esper Sentinel is really cute, but Thought Monitor will also often be a very cheap creature that draws us some extra cards, and that's really worth celebrating. Cyclonic Rift, meanwhile, is super spicy, but Fell the Mighty would also serve as another oft one-sided board wipe for us, keeping our tiny pilots around and leaving our gigantic machines ready to rumble. And that's not all. Unwinding Clock is definitely one of the MVPs of the deck, no doubt, but it's a pricey card, and if that's not in your toolkit, Damon put forth a very cool suggestion. Teleportation Circle. It blinks Shorikai, which resets it so that we can use its untap ability again immediately, and we actually have a couple of other cool ETB effects that could help us reuse too. Blink the Quartermaster again to find another vehicle, or blink one of our vehicles so that it can deal more damage when it enters the battlefield again, or heck, we can even reset our mech's identity, which is pretty awesome. Then we gotta talk Mana Rocks, cause there's also the Talisman, which for some reason did not get reprinted in either one of the back-to-back Azorius pre-constructed decks that we've recently received, and that has resulted in this simple but highly demanded Mana Rock becoming a $15 card, which is ludicrous, and that could have been avoided if it had been reprinted in either of those Azorius precons. But anyway, budget swap, play Liquid Metal Torque instead. It's nice. Oh, and Smothering Tithe is in this deck too, which is a very expensive card, and I'm actually not even going to suggest a direct replacement for this one at all, because it's, Smothering Tithe, kind of a one-of-a-kind effect here. But instead, I think this deck might be a cool place to try out a different white token-making card, and that's Dig Site Engineer. We play a decent number of artifacts, and these tokens could get pretty big, either to crew the mechs or to get powered up by them. This is a cool card. I hope that it starts to see more play, because there's a lot of great potential with this one. And real quick, let's briefly visit the opposite side of the racetrack. What if you're making a Shorikai deck that's more luxurious than this average list was? Well, your first target is probably gonna be Minamo. Untaps the commander to help it do its thing more and more. Beautiful piece of work. Tezzeret the Seeker is worth mentioning here too, tutoring stuff up and untapping our vehicles so that we have them at the ready whenever we need them. And more protective spells really wouldn't go amiss in this deck either. Shorikai spends a lot of time in play, and we want to keep it that way. And I also want to mention that Shorikai can be a very volatile combo engine too. If you're familiar with the likes of Dramatic Reversal and Isochron Scepter, they can combine with just a few Mana Rocks to constantly untap all of your stuff and give you infinite mana. And with Shorikai in play, also getting untapped over and over again, you can use all that mana to draw your entire deck. So take heed of this one. This looks like a commander that's ripe for combos if you have a need for speed. Alright, that'll do it for us. The Genesis engine is revved up and ready to go. You can find a link to the decklist in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you had a good joyride with Shorikai, and if you have any recommendations for your fellow EDH drivers, make sure you leave them down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.